They lied to you. Your teachers lied to you. Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. When British explorers saw Benin City, they couldn't believe what they saw. Paved streets illuminated by oil lamps, walls longer than the Great Wall of China, and a civilization more organized than anything they had ever built. So they did what empires always do when confronted by a mirror that shows their own inferiority. They burned it, stole its treasures, and called Africa primitive. But this is not a story of tragedy. It is a story of brilliance, betrayal, and rebirth. The rise of a city that defied every colonial myth. The Kingdom of Benin, in what is now southern Nigeria, was once one of the most advanced and artistically magnificent civilizations on Earth. At its height, it was a beacon of order, beauty, and power, a living testament to what African genius can create when left unbroken. Picture it. The year is 1600. London is still choked with mud streets and open sewers. The smell of rot hangs over the Thames. The night is black, unlit, unpaved, and unsafe. Across the seas, beyond the Niger Delta, another city gleams like a dream. Benin City, the capital of an empire whose artisans carve bronze as fine as any sculpture in Rome, whose streets are wide and straight, whose people live under laws that protect fairness and peace. European traders who enter its gates write in disbelief, describing a city so orderly that no one dares to steal, and the people obey their king as if he were God. The Oba of Benin, king, priest, and guardian of his people, presided over a society that balanced spiritual devotion with political precision. His palace was not just a royal home, but a universe of art. Thousands of bronze plaques covering its walls, each telling stories of ancestors, conquests, and cosmic balance. Every piece, every pattern, every glint of polished metal reflected a culture that had been refining itself for over 1,000 years. But none of this fit the story Europe wanted to tell about Africa. They needed the continent to be a blank page, dark, chaotic, waiting for civilization. Yet when Portuguese merchants and later British traders arrived in Benin, they saw something that shattered their illusion. They saw a planned metropolis, streets laid out in precise grids, houses built in rows, drainage systems that worked, courtyards where musicians played for kings, and marketplaces where art, ivory, and wisdom were traded like gold. They wrote letters home in astonishment. "The city is so well governed," one observer wrote in the 17th century, "that theft is unknown, and the people live in such order that I have never seen the like." The British would later pretend these words were never written. They would silence their own eyewitnesses to maintain a lie, that Africa had no civilization before Europe arrived. But the evidence remains, carved in bronze, buried in red earth, whispered in the oral histories that survived fire and looting. The Benin bronzes, shimmering sculptures of brass and ivory, were not just art, they were the archive of a people. They recorded wars, coronations, rituals, and treaties. They were historical documents in metal, forged by artists who were both historians and spiritual engineers. Each plaque told a truth about power and identity that colonialism tried to erase. In this story, Benin City becomes more than a place, it becomes a mirror. It reflects the fear of those who saw greatness where they expected nothing. It exposes how colonial violence was never about bringing civilization, but about destroying competition. Because if the world had known what Benin was, a structured, literate, urban, and technologically skilled African civilization, the lie of European superiority would have crumbled centuries ago. And that is why they had to burn it. In 1897, the British Empire launched the so-called punitive expedition, a mission not of justice, but of jealousy. Over 2,000 soldiers stormed the city, slaughtered its people, stole its treasures, and set its beauty ablaze. The city that once glowed under the night lamps of Africa's own ingenuity became a sea of smoke and ruin. The world was told that Benin was savage, a justification for theft, a smokescreen for envy. But the truth survived, in the art they couldn't destroy, in the stories carried by survivors, in the spirit of a people who remember. Benin's legacy did not end in fire. It endures in the blood of millions who still walk those ancestral lands, in the artists who cast metal with ancestral precision, in the scholars and griots who are piecing together the fragments of a stolen world. Tonight you will see that story come alive again. You will walk the luminous streets that once made London blush with shame. You will meet the kings, the warriors, the sculptors, and the visionaries who built a city so advanced that history tried to erase it. And as the smoke clears, you will understand the truth. Africa was never behind. It was the world's first light, and the city of Benin was one of its brightest flames. Because they didn't destroy civilization in 1897, they only destroyed the evidence that it started here. They told you Benin was a jungle kingdom. They said its people were bloodthirsty, its king a tyrant, its ways barbaric. That was the story printed in the newspapers of London and Manchester in the 19th century, a tale designed to feed an empire's hunger for moral justification. We are bringing order to chaos, they said. We are civilizing the savage. But beneath those words was fear. Fear of a civilization that needed no rescuing. Fear of an Africa that stood as proof that Europe was not the sole author of progress. When the British public read about the Benin expedition, they were told of a monstrous kingdom that ambushed English officers and needed to be subdued. The images were gruesome, the descriptions exaggerated, the conclusions predictable. Britain must avenge its dead and bring civilization to the dark interior. But the truth was that Benin had lived in equilibrium for centuries, a self-governing, spiritually guided state that did not seek conquest, but order. Its restrictions on European traders were not acts of hostility, but of sovereignty. The Oba of Benin had seen enough of Europe's intentions. He understood that trade was never just trade. It was a prelude to control. So when the British envoy in 1897 ignored his warnings and invaded during a sacred festival, it was not an act of diplomacy, but provocation. The small Benin force that responded was defending its home, not declaring war. Yet this single confrontation became the pretext for annihilation, the excuse the empire needed to erase what it could not control. And so the punitive expedition was launched. 1,200 soldiers, armed with Maxim guns, rockets, and fire. The lie had found its weapon. But the lie didn't start in 1897. It was centuries in the making. As early as the 1500s, when Portuguese sailors first entered Benin's harbors, they were astonished by what they saw. They wrote that the city was as large as Lisbon, and so well laid out that one can hardly believe it to be African. And yet, in the centuries that followed, those same European nations would twist their words, editing admiration into condescension. They would say that whatever beauty existed in Benin was the result of contact with them, not the product of African creativity. It was the beginning of a historical theft more insidious than any looting, the theft of credit, the theft of authorship. For Europe to justify slavery, colonization, and centuries of exploitation, it needed a myth that Africa was timeless, stagnant, and undeveloped until Europe arrived. The myth became law, printed in textbooks, taught in schools, carved into the pillars of empire. And because Benin stood as living proof of its falseness, an organized, wealthy, literate society with complex governance and art rivaling the Renaissance, it had to be reduced to rubble. But imagine, for a moment, being a European trader standing before Benin's massive earthen walls, walls that stretched for hundreds of miles, encircling the kingdom, like the coils of a serpent. Archaeologists today call them one of the greatest earthworks ever built by human hands. Each wall was layered with precision, engineered to control water flow and defend the city. They weren't chaotic mounds of dirt. They were architectural marvels that took generations to perfect. And yet, colonial reports dismissed them as mysterious mounds, as though the soil had risen by accident. Even the art of Benin, those luminous bronzes now displayed in museums across Europe, was once called too advanced to be African. The British Museum, clutching its stolen treasures, claimed the craftsmanship must have come from lost white settlers or Portuguese teachers. They could not imagine that African hands, black hands, had shaped metal with such mastery. To admit that would have shattered the foundation of white supremacy that justified empire. The lie metastasized. It was copied, quoted, institutionalized. Western universities built their anthropology on the assumption that Africa was a continent of tribes, not nations, of drummers and dancers, not scientists and engineers. They called Benin's people primitive, while wearing gold melted from its stolen plaques. They spoke of bringing light to Africa while sitting beneath lamps whose filaments were paid for with ivory and blood. But history has a way of resurrecting itself, even from ashes. Beneath the propaganda, the truth still smoldered, in letters, in oral traditions, in the artifacts that refused to die. British officers who participated in the raid wrote in private diaries of the grandeur they destroyed. One admitted, the city was so beautiful, it seemed almost wicked to burn it. Another confessed, the bronzes are the work of a people with genius equal to any in Europe. They saw it, they knew, but their words were locked away, classified under silence and shame. And so for a century, the lie stood unchallenged. Africa as the pupil, Europe as the teacher. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, as decolonization began, that scholars started to uncover the truth buried beneath imperial propaganda. The more they looked, the more impossible the lie became. Excavations revealed urban planning centuries ahead of its time. Oral histories mapped dynasties older than most European states. Linguistic evidence showed governance systems built on consultation, not conquest. Benin City was never primitive. It was deliberate. Its geometry reflected a cosmology of balance. Its politics, a system of ethics rooted in community. It was an African democracy of duty and discipline, a world where power was sacred, not selfish. The British didn't civilize Benin, they dismantled it. And when they told the world that Africa had no history, no architecture, no government, they were describing the ruins they themselves had made. The lie, then, was not just a distortion of history, it was an act of violence. Because when you strip a people of their memory, you steal their future. And that is exactly what was done to Benin, and to Africa as a whole. But memory is not so easily erased. The fire that consumed the city did not consume the truth. It lived on in the silence between generations, waiting to be spoken again. And now, as we dig through time and reclaim what was taken, we see the lie for what it was, a weapon of fear wielded against brilliance. The revelation began in the unlikeliest of places, in the very vaults and museums built to conceal it. Behind glass cases in London, Berlin, and Vienna, the truth of Benin lay waiting. Thousands of bronzes, ivory tusks, carved heads, and sacred plaques, each one whispering the name of a city that Europe had tried to erase. For decades, these artifacts were labeled as curiosities, trophies of empire, or primitive art. But when historians began to study them closely, the lie began to fracture. Because the bronzes did not tell the story of savagery, they told the story of civilization. Each piece was a fragment of a larger vision, a history cast in metal, encoded with power and precision. The bronze plaques that once adorned the palace walls were not random decorations. They were a visual archive, each one documenting events, lineages, and laws. They showed the Oba, seated in majesty, flanked by his warriors and chiefs. They showed ceremonies, conquests, processions, and foreign emissaries arriving from across the seas. They showed not chaos, but order, not barbarism, but brilliance. When experts finally analyzed how these bronzes were made, they found techniques that stunned metallurgists. The lost wax casting method, a complex process of sculpting, molding, and alloying, had been mastered in Benin centuries before it became common in Europe. The level of detail in the human faces, the fine lines etched into armor and fabric, the symmetry of crowns and weapons, all of it revealed an artistic intelligence that rivaled any found in Florence or Athens. But these artists were not anonymous slaves. They were members of the Egan Iran I, the Royal Guild of Bronze Casters, a hereditary class of artisans who passed down their secrets from father to son, generation to generation, guided by ritual and spiritual discipline. In Benin, art was not merely decoration, it was governance. The Oba's court used art as law, as memory, as moral compass. Each bronze plaque served as a visual contract between ruler and people, between ancestors and descendants. The sculptor was not just recording history, he was binding it to eternity. And this is where the revelation cuts deepest. Africa was not a place without history. It was a place where history lived in form, sound, and rhythm, rather than on paper. Europe wrote, Africa remembered. Even the very layout of Benin City was a revelation once rediscovered. Long before the word urban planning existed, Benin had mastered it. Archaeologists, mapping its ruins, discovered a design based on sacred geometry, concentric zones radiating outward from the Oba's palace, each representing hierarchy, order, and connection. The streets ran straight and wide, often lined with palm trees and guarded by walls that were both defensive and symbolic. The kingdom itself was a map of cosmic balance, reflecting the harmony between heaven, earth, and the ancestors. This harmony extended to governance. The Oba did not rule as a dictator, but as a divine mediator, balanced by councils of chiefs who represented different sectors of society: warriors, priests, traders, and artisans. Each had voice and power. Decisions were debated, ceremonies consulted the spirits, and justice was a sacred duty. It was a system both spiritual and constitutional. Centuries before Europe's so-called Enlightenment, the revelation deepened when researchers found parallels between Benin's values and modern democratic principles. In Benin, no king could act without the counsel of his chiefs. No policy could proceed without ritual consultation. Accountability was spiritual as well as social. The king was not above the law, he was the law, embodied, and therefore bound by its truth. When Europe preached about civilizing Africa, it was preaching to a continent that had already mastered balance between power and principle. But the revelation wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. For descendants of Africa scattered across the world, seeing the bronzes for the first time was like glimpsing a lost reflection. The precision of the faces, the confidence in their posture, the regal calm of their eyes, it was the opposite of the colonial image. These were not the savages depicted in textbooks. They were architects, priests, philosophers, scientists. Each plaque radiated self-assurance, a declaration that blackness had always been royal, always been inventive, always been divine. As word spread, and historians began to speak out, the silence around Benin cracked. The old museum plaques that once said unknown African tribe were replaced with names, dates, dynasties. European institutions could no longer hide behind ignorance. They were forced to admit what they had always known, that they were displaying the stolen masterpieces of one of Africa's greatest civilizations. In 2021, after over a century of denial, even the British Museum began facing questions it could no longer ignore. How could a people considered primitive have produced art more refined than Europe's own? How could a city deemed barbaric have created laws and architecture centuries ahead of its colonizers? The answer, of course, was simple. The labels had been lies all along. Each recovered artifact was a revelation and an indictment. The bronze heads were not only portraits, they were proof. Proof that Africa's technological, artistic, and moral evolution was not borrowed but born from within. Proof that civilization did not radiate from Europe outward, but from humanity's oldest soil, Africa. And when modern Nigerians and Pan-African scholars began to call for the return of these treasures, the debate became more than political. It became spiritual. Because returning the bronzes meant returning memory. It meant restoring to Africa a mirror long denied. The revelation of Benin was not just about history, it was about identity. It said to the world, "We were never what you called us." The smoke of 1897 has long faded, but the light that once filled Benin streets has returned. In the gleam of the bronzes, in the pride of the descendants, in the knowledge that no matter how deeply the truth is buried, it cannot be erased. What was once hidden in vaults now speaks louder than any empire's lies. Because you can steal a statue, but you can't steal genius. Long before Benin became a city of bronze and firelight, it was a whisper carried on the wind of the African rainforest, a seed of destiny planted in red earth. Its story begins over 1,000 years ago, in the ancient kingdom of Ilefi, the sacred cradle of Yoruba civilization. From If came wisdom, art, and the divine concept of kingship, the idea that a ruler was not merely human, but a bridge between heaven and earth. It was from this sacred lineage that Benin drew its lifeblood. The legend tells of a time when the Edo people, the ancestors of the Benin, lived under the rule of local chiefs, known as the Ogiso. They were wise and powerful, but as centuries passed, their unity fractured. Chaos and conflict began to spread across the land. The elders of Benin, seeking order and divine legitimacy, sent a message to If, the city of the gods, asking for a ruler of divine birth to restore balance. And If answered. From its royal line came Oranmiyan, son of Oduduwa, himself a demigod in Yoruba tradition. Oranmiyan journeyed across forests and rivers to the heart of Benin, where he founded a new dynasty. His rule was brief, but his bloodline endured, for when he left behind a son, Uweka Si, who would become the first Oba of Benin. This was no ordinary transition. It marked the rebirth of a nation under divine law. Uweka Si restructured the kingdom, transforming a cluster of villages into a unified state. He brought the sacred rituals of kingship from If, but rooted them deeply in Edo soil. The people now had not just a king, but a cosmic anchor, a leader whose authority came from both earth and heaven. Under his successors, Benin grew from a regional power into a force that commanded respect across West Africa. Over the next centuries, the Obas of Benin built not just a kingdom but a civilization. They constructed moats and walls that spanned thousands of kilometers, defensive marvels that some archaeologists say rivaled the Great Wall of China in sheer length and ambition. The walls were not just barriers of clay and wood, they were symbols of sacred geometry, tracing the boundaries of both protection and identity. Inside those walls a city flourished. At its heart stood the royal palace, a vast labyrinth of courtyards, shrines and chambers that served as the spiritual and political center of the empire. Its roofs were made of palm leaves, its walls decorated with intricate carvings, and its gates guarded by fierce bronze leopards, the symbol of royal authority. Each courtyard echoed with the rhythm of life, drummers calling to ceremony, artisans shaping metal and ivory, priests chanting invocations to the gods. This was not a kingdom of chaos. It was a machine of order. Society was organized with mathematical precision. At the top sat the Oba, divine yet bound by sacred law. Below him, powerful chiefs, the Uzama, advised on governance. Beneath them were the guilds, blacksmiths, weavers, carvers, traders, and warriors, each with their duties, traditions, and codes. Every man and woman knew their place. Every ritual had meaning. Every symbol connected the people to their ancestors. Trade brought Benin wealth beyond imagination. Its ports opened to the Niger Delta, linking it to vast trade networks, stretching across Africa and beyond. Ivory, pepper, coral, palm oil, and art flowed outward. Gold, silk, and metals flowed in. Portuguese explorers arriving in the 15th century described a kingdom rich in discipline and sophistication. They saw soldiers in formation, administrators recording taxes, and craftsmen casting bronzes that captured both beauty and divinity. But Benin's greatness was not measured in gold alone. It was measured in wisdom. The Obas saw themselves not as conquerors but as custodians of harmony. They expanded their realm carefully, blending diplomacy and warfare, ensuring that conquered lands were integrated into the kingdom through marriage, ritual, and trade, rather than annihilation. It was empire built on balance, a rare model in human history. Religion was the soul of Benin. The people worshipped Olokun, the god of the sea and wealth, Ogun, the spirit of iron and war, and countless ancestors whose spirits guarded their descendants. Every act, from casting bronze to planting crops, was a prayer in motion. The Oba himself was a living shrine, his bloodline said to contain divine essence. His coronation was not merely political, it was cosmic renewal, a ceremony that reaffirmed the bond between heaven, earth, and the people. Under Oba Iwar the Great in the 15th century, Benin reached its golden age. Iwar transformed the city into a marvel of architecture and symbolism. He ordered new moats dug, new roads carved, and established festivals that celebrated the unity of gods and men. He restructured the government into a more efficient hierarchy and built the sacred altars that would later become immortalized in bronze. His reign marked the dawn of what historians now call the Benin Empire. By the time the first Europeans arrived, Benin was already ancient, a place of protocol and majesty that commanded awe. The Portuguese called it the Great City of Benin. They recorded its streets, its markets, its courtyards, and its silence, a silence of respect, of order, of civilization. They saw a people who did not need civilization because they had built their own centuries before Europe emerged from its own dark ages. But this magnificence would not go unchallenged. With admiration came greed, and with greed came the slow erosion of trust. The same world that marveled at Benin's bronzes would later melt them down for coins. The same visitors who praised its discipline would one day call it barbaric. The stage was being set for betrayal, not because Benin was weak, but because it was too strong a mirror for empire to tolerate. The fire that would one day consume the city began as a whisper, the hum of European envy echoing through the forests. The Kingdom of Benin stood proud and shining, but in the distance, the storm was already forming. They say a kingdom is only as strong as its people, and in Benin, every man, woman, and child carried the spirit of a civilization within them. The city did not rise from the will of kings alone. It was built by hands, hearts, and minds that worked in divine rhythm. To understand Benin's greatness, you must meet its people, the sculptors who gave metal a soul, the warriors who guarded the sacred walls, the traders who bridged worlds, and the priests who spoke to the ancestors through fire and song. In the royal quarter, the Igen Aaron I, the guild of bronze casters, worked in near silence, their forges glowing like miniature suns. These men were not mere craftsmen, they were keepers of memory. Their work was ritual, their art a form of prayer. Each figure they cast was an invocation to the gods and a record of human triumph. To cast bronze in Benin was to engage in divine imitation, to do what only the gods were believed to do, breathe permanence into the world. The process was sacred. They sculpted figures first in beeswax, molding every detail, from the curl of a warrior's lip to the texture of royal coral beads. Then they encased the wax in clay and fired it until the wax melted away, leaving a hollow mold. Into that cavity, they poured molten metal, glowing with the heat of creation. When it cooled, they broke the clay, revealing the figure within, never to be duplicated, each piece unique and eternal. To the casters, this was not technology, it was ancestral resurrection. Across the city, the warriors of Benin trained with equal devotion. The royal army was not an undisciplined horde, but a structured force of strategy and ceremony. Each regiment was commanded by chiefs, bound by oath to the Oba, their loyalty reinforced by ritual. The warriors wore armor of leather and iron, their bodies adorned with protective charms, their spirits fortified by the songs of priests. Before battle, offerings were made at shrines of Ogun, the god of war and metal. Victory was not just a matter of arms, it was a covenant between man, ancestor, and spirit. Benin's warriors were feared across the region, not only for their strength, but for their discipline. They fought not for plunder, but for balance, to protect trade routes, uphold the Oba's authority, and maintain peace within the sacred order of the kingdom. Their campaigns were measured, strategic, and rarely reckless. In a world where power often meant destruction, Benin's armies fought to preserve. Beyond the walls, the lifeblood of Benin flowed through its markets, vibrant centers of trade, where men and women exchanged goods, stories, and laughter beneath the sun. The markets were the heart of the economy, but also of community. Women played a central role here, not as subordinates, but as entrepreneurs and negotiators. They controlled trade in cloth, beads, spices, and food, maintaining balance in the kingdom's daily rhythm. In Benin, female power was woven into the fabric of society. The Ioba, the Queen Mother, held enormous political and spiritual influence, her voice echoing in the Oba's court and in the hearts of the people. The most famous of these women was Idia, the mother of Oba Ezigi, who ruled in the early 16th century. When her son ascended the throne, she became his chief advisor and protector. It was Idia who used diplomacy and mysticism to save Benin during its wars with neighboring states. Her image, serene, powerful, crowned with coral, became one of Benin's most iconic symbols, immortalized in ivory masks that would later travel across the world as masterpieces of African art. But to her people, she was not art, she was memory, a reminder that in Benin, the feminine was sacred and indispensable to power. And then there were the priests, the keepers of rhythm, the mediators between seen and unseen. They tended to the altars of the gods, interpreted dreams, and guided the Oba through the invisible currents of destiny. In their rituals, drumming was language, fire was scripture, and dance was prayer. The people of Benin did not separate the spiritual from the practical. Life itself was a ceremony. Every harvest, every victory, every birth and death was part of the cosmic dance that connected the living with the dead and the unborn. Benin's artists, warriors, and priests worked as one body, each discipline feeding the others. The sculptor immortalized the warrior in bronze. The priest sanctified the warrior's blade. The Queen Mother counseled the king before war. The merchant financed the festivals that honored the gods. It was a social ecosystem of divine precision, a world where creativity, discipline, and devotion were indistinguishable. Foreign visitors could not comprehend it. They saw only fragments, the glittering armor, the coral beads, the processions of masked dancers. They recorded these sights in journals, but missed the meaning. What they called pageantry was actually philosophy. Every gesture, every ornament, every rhythm was part of an unbroken code, one that kept the kingdom in harmony for centuries. The people of Benin lived in the knowledge that their actions echoed into eternity. A blacksmith did not simply forge a tool, he shaped destiny. A mother did not simply raise a child, she raised a lineage. A dancer did not simply move to music, she reenacted creation itself. This consciousness, this unity of art and spirit, is what gave Benin its strength. And yet, beneath that beauty, history's shadow loomed. The same traits that made Benin powerful, its wealth, its artistry, its order, would soon draw the gaze of empires that knew only how to conquer what they could not understand. The world beyond the forest was changing. Cannons and greed were replacing curiosity and respect. The people of Benin continued to live as they always had, in harmony with their gods, proud in their work, unbroken in their spirit. They could not have known that distant nations were already plotting to turn their sacred city into a museum exhibit of its own destruction. Because when a people create beauty that rivals empires, the empires will come, not to learn, but to steal. It began with envy disguised as diplomacy. By the late 19th century, the world's empires were carving Africa like vultures around a feast, and the Kingdom of Benin sat on land too rich, too organized, and too independent to escape their hunger. To the British Empire, Benin was not merely a trading partner, it was an obstacle. Its Oba, Ovan Ramwen Nagbazi, refused to submit to unfair treaties, refused to surrender sovereignty, and refused to let his people be exploited by the merchants and administrators who came bearing flags of civilization and hearts full of greed. Europe wanted palm oil, ivory, rubber, the lifeblood of Africa's forests. Benin had them all, but on its own terms. For centuries, it had traded with Europeans without losing control. It set prices, demanded respect, and treated foreign traders as guests, not masters. This autonomy enraged Britain, which had grown used to dictating terms across the continent. And so, as it had done elsewhere, the empire crafted a lie, the same lie it used to justify every conquest, that Benin was savage, backward, and in need of punishment. The stage for destruction was set in 1897. The British had sent a series of trade envoys to Benin, demanding open access and the right to free trade, code for exploitation. The Oba, guided by priests and elders, refused. He understood what submission meant. He had seen the fate of other African states that signed away their power in ink and blood. When one final British delegation arrived during a sacred festival, a time when visitors were forbidden, the Oba's chiefs begged them to wait, but arrogance drowned out caution. They marched forward anyway, into a land whose laws they neither understood nor respected. The meeting ended in disaster. A skirmish erupted on the forest road, gunfire, confusion, and death. Several members of the British delegation were killed. Instantly, London seized its excuse. The headlines screamed of massacre, and within days, the British government declared that Benin must be punished. What followed was not a mission of justice, it was premeditated revenge. In February of 1897, a massive expeditionary force, over 2,000 British soldiers, sailors, and Marines, armed with Maxim guns, cannons, and rifles, set sail for the Niger Delta. They called it the Benin Punitive Expedition. What they carried was not law but fire. Their orders were simple: invade, destroy, loot, and burn. When the columns reached Benin City, they met fierce resistance. The warriors of Benin fought with valor, spears and arrows against bullets and machine guns. They fought for their ancestors, their gods, their king, but the imbalance of power was devastating. The British marched through the sacred gates, burning everything in their path. Shrines were desecrated, temples torched, women and children slaughtered. The city that had once been described as the most beautiful in the world was consumed by flames that turned the night sky red. The palace of the Oba, a place of worship, history, and art, was ransacked. Thousands of bronze plaques, ivory carvings, coral regalia, and sacred masks were stolen. The British officers packed the treasures into crates and shipped them to England, where they were sold to museums and collectors. The same men who called Benin barbaric now auctioned its genius for profit. They found the Oba hiding in the forest, not as a coward, but as a king who refused to watch his people's slaughter. When captured, he was stripped of his coral regalia, photographed in humiliation, and exiled to Calabar. They paraded him as proof of conquest, a trophy of imperial pride. But even in exile, he held his dignity. His eyes in that infamous photograph are not of defeat. They are eyes that see through time, eyes that know history will judge differently. The British burned Benin City to ashes, then rewrote the story. They called it a rescue mission. They said they had liberated the region from tyranny. They printed textbooks declaring that Benin had been savage, and that its art had been inspired by outsiders, too advanced, they claimed, to be African. The lie became official history. In truth, the punitive expedition was one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in human history. The bronzes, once sacred records of a civilization, became trophies in European museums, stripped of meaning, mislabeled as tribal curiosities. The British governors who took over the region built their offices on the ruins of palaces, turning sacred ground into colonial administrative centers. They used Benin's destruction as proof that Africa needed control, that empire was civilization. But beneath the ashes, something survived: the people. They carried with them fragments of their history, songs, symbols, rituals. The city would rebuild. The bronzes would one day speak again. For though the fires devoured wood and stone, they could not burn the spirit of a civilization that had already outshone London before London even had streets of its own. The suppression of Benin was more than physical. It was psychological. They did not just want to conquer a city. They wanted to erase the memory that Africans had built a world of order and beauty without European hands. To them, Benin was dangerous, not because it was barbaric, but because it proved Europe's myths wrong. Yet truth has a strange endurance. The same bronzes stolen as trophies now stand in glass cases where the whole world can see them, their craftsmanship undeniable, their silence louder than words. Each one whispers the same defiance. You tried to erase us, but here we are. That whisper became a movement, across Africa, across the diaspora, across generations. The descendants of Benin's artisans, priests and warriors began to rise again, demanding not pity but respect, not charity but restitution. And as the calls for the return of the bronzes grew louder, the world began to realize what Britain burned was not a city. It was the evidence that Africa had already known greatness, and that truth, once rediscovered, could never again be buried. The ashes spoke. Long after the flames died, long after the smoke had drifted across the Atlantic, long after the last British gunboat disappeared down the Niger, Benin's voice refused to fade. In the silence of the ruins, the bronzes began to whisper again, not from the palace where they once gleamed, but from the cold halls of European museums. The empire had taken them as trophies, but the art had its own plan. Each face cast in bronze, each plaque of a warrior, each ivory carving of a queen, all of them became witnesses, eternal and unyielding. They stared from behind glass, saying, "We were never what you said we were." At first, the colonizers didn't understand the weapon they had placed on display. To them, the Benin bronzes were proof of their conquest, a demonstration of what Britain could seize, catalog, and claim. They hung the pieces in the British Museum, as if the act of possession itself had turned theft into scholarship. They called it anthropology. They called it art history. They called it civilization. But the truth was molten beneath the surface. Every piece of bronze was an indictment. Every plaque was evidence. It didn't take long for cracks to appear in the story. Scholars who saw the bronzes began to question how such complexity could emerge from a people the empire had labeled barbaric. The level of metallurgical skill defied 19th century European understanding. Lost wax casting, alloy control, and fine detailing that matched or surpassed Renaissance craftsmanship. The plaques showed processions, warriors, musicians, merchants, and kings, scenes of power and prosperity. These were not primitive trinkets. They were historical documents, encoded in metal, documenting centuries of African order and empire. The British could not explain it. They told themselves lies to stay comfortable. Maybe the Portuguese taught them. Maybe it was copied from foreign styles, but the bronzes carried motifs that predated European contact by hundreds of years. They showed ritual and lineage, rooted in an African cosmology older than the empire itself. Slowly, the Western scholars who studied them had to face the uncomfortable truth. Benin had been civilized long before London learned to pave its streets. Then something happened that the empire did not expect. The same objects it had stolen to prove African inferiority became the very evidence that destroyed that myth. In lecture halls and art salons, the conversation shifted. Anthropologists began to realize that Africa's history was not a blank space waiting to be filled by Europe. It was a continent of kings and city builders, philosophers and astronomers, engineers and artists. The Benin bronzes became the spearhead of that revelation. By the mid-20th century, as African nations rose toward independence, the art of Benin became a rallying cry. Black intellectuals and revolutionaries pointed to those bronzes as proof that Africa had built civilizations worthy of pride long before colonization. The bronzes became more than art, they were resurrection. In Lagos, in Accra, in Dakar, people whispered their names like prayers. Benin had fallen in fire, but its art had become scripture. Across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and the Americas, the story resonated with the descendants of the enslaved. Those who had been told they came from darkness now learned they came from cities that shone brighter than London. They began to paint, to sculpt, to sing, and in their art, the memory of Benin returned. Jazz, calypso, reggae, gospel, all carried echoes of the rhythm of bronze. The diaspora began to reclaim Africa, not as an abstract motherland, but as a living civilization that had once ruled with balance and brilliance. Even in Europe, the truth began to haunt the institutions that had hidden it. Curators in London, Berlin, and Paris found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. How did these treasures get here? Why do they remain? And what does it mean to celebrate art stolen from the ashes of empire? The world was changing. The moral foundation of empire was crumbling. By the 1960s and 70s, African historians and artists took the lead. Nigerian scholars, like Jacob Egarevba and Osemwowa Oviawe, began to document the oral histories of Benin, the stories of its obas, its guilds, its laws. Their research proved what had long been known in the heart of the Edo people. Benin's art was not an anomaly, it was the visual language of a sophisticated society. These weren't isolated masterpieces, they were a collective archive of a civilization that governed itself with elegance and depth. And as the truth spread, the empire's narrative began to rot. The Western museums that had once been symbols of power became prisons for the very evidence that betrayed them. Every time a child from Nigeria, Ghana, or the Caribbean stood before a Benin plaque in the British Museum, the lie cracked a little more. They looked up at those faces, proud, stoic, regal, and saw themselves. They saw what had been hidden. The bronzes began to act like mirrors, forcing the world to confront the reflection it had tried to avoid. Visitors who once came to marvel at exotic African craftsmanship began to leave uneasy, sensing that something was wrong, that these works did not belong in these halls of empire. The more people looked, the clearer it became. This was not preservation, it was imprisonment. And from that realization, a movement was born. Artists, scholars, and activists across the world began demanding restitution, not just of objects, but of memory. They said, "Return what you stole, return the narrative, return the truth." Because the truth was this: Benin did not need validation from Europe. Its civilization had validated itself long before empire existed. The bronzes did not need museums to be immortal. They had already survived fire, exile, and time. They had carried the story of Benin through the darkness and now stood ready to bring it into light again. The empire thought it had silenced Benin by burning it to the ground. Instead, it had made the kingdom immortal. The art it stole became the voice of Africa reborn. And as the world began to listen, the question shifted from did Benin deserve its place in history to what does it say about history that it ever lost it. The world moves in circles. What is taken will one day return, and what is buried will rise again. For more than a century, the Benin bronzes waited, scattered across continents, locked in vaults, mislabeled in glass cases, staring silently at those who had forgotten their names. But time has a rhythm, and truth always keeps the beat. The ancestors were patient, and when the world was finally ready to listen, they began to come home. It started as whispers in the halls of academia, uncomfortable questions about provenance, about the ethics of empire. Then came the documentaries, the protests, the petitions. African scholars demanded answers. Students stood before British and German museum boards, their voices trembling, but their resolve unshakable. Return them. Return what you stole. The movement gathered momentum in the digital age. Images of the bronzes flooded social media, their gleaming faces now symbols of a stolen legacy. The world could see, with painful clarity, the beauty that had been hidden behind the word primitive. The outrage spread like fire. The more people learned, the harder it became to justify keeping what was not theirs. In 2018, a turning point arrived. French President Emmanuel Macron stood in Ouagadougou and declared, "African heritage cannot remain a prisoner of European museums." His words sent shockwaves through the cultural establishment. It was the first admission, from a head of state, that Europe's museums were built on theft. Soon after, the French government commissioned a report led by Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, two scholars who exposed, in meticulous detail, the scope of African looting. Their conclusion was simple: return everything that was taken without consent. The report became a spark that ignited the conscience of the world. In Germany, curators at the Humboldt Forum began to question their own collections. The truth was undeniable. Over 1,000 Benin bronzes lay in German museums, relics of colonial violence. In 2021, Germany made history by announcing the repatriation of hundreds of pieces to Nigeria. For the first time since 1897, crates marked Benin began their journey home, not as plunder, but as reconciliation. The return ceremonies were unlike anything the world had seen. When the bronzes arrived in Benin City, the streets filled with music, with dance, with prayer. Elders wept. Children reached out their hands to touch the faces of their ancestors. The Oba of Benin, wrapped in coral beads that glowed like fire in the sun, stood before the crowd and said, "Our fathers have returned." It was not just a political act. It was a spiritual homecoming. Each bronze carried more than history. It carried energy. The Edo people believed that every artwork forged in the royal guilds was born from invocation, that each cast head, each relief plaque, contains the essence of the ancestors it depicts. When those pieces left, a part of Benin's soul left with them, and when they returned, the city itself breathed again. The ceremonies were heavy with symbolism. Libations were poured to the earth. The drums of Ige thundered in rhythm with the heartbeat of the crowd. Women adorned in coral and white sang songs that had not been heard since before the invasion. The bronzes were placed in sacred chambers within the Oba's palace, not as museum exhibits, but as family reunited. The ancestors, they said, were finally at peace. Across the world, this return ignited something deeper, a reckoning not just with the theft of objects, but with the theft of truth. Museums that had built reputations on world heritage began facing lawsuits, protests, and moral collapse. The British Museum, holding over 900 Benin pieces, became the center of a storm. Each headline, each petition, each angry voice echoed the same message: the empire's treasures are Africa's tears. But the movement was not just about restitution. It was about reclamation, of memory, of pride, of authorship. African nations began investing in their own institutions, building spaces that would house the returning artifacts with reverence and modern innovation. In Nigeria, plans were made for the Edo Museum of West African Art, a grand project in Benin City, designed not as a colonial replica, but as a living archive of African excellence. Its walls would hold not only the bronzes, but the stories of the people who created them, told by African voices, in African rhythms. The diaspora joined the movement, bridging continents with solidarity. From Jamaica to Chicago, from London to Lagos, people of African descent celebrated the homecoming as their own. Artists created installations, musicians composed tributes, poets spoke the names of the Obas in verse. The bronzes had become more than symbols. They were proof that Africa's light could never be extinguished. And the returns continued. Universities, private collectors, and even churches began to quietly send pieces back. Some did so publicly, others in silence. Each one was a confession, a small piece of justice. The long road of repair had begun. Yet the story was not only about the artifacts returning, it was about what they awakened. In Benin, young artists took inspiration from the bronzes, learning the old lost wax methods, fusing tradition with innovation. Sculptors cast new works, not to replace what was lost, but to continue the lineage. The city was alive again, with creation, echoing the hum of furnaces and the ring of hammers on metal. The same art that once adorned the palaces now inspired a new generation to dream bigger. For the first time in a century, the spiritual map of Benin was complete again. The stolen voices had come home, and with them, the story had been restored. The empire once called it conquest. The world now calls it theft. But in Benin, they call it return, the fulfillment of prophecy. Because the elders always said, the ancestors never sleep. They wait until justice wakes the living. And now, justice has begun to stir. The ashes that once spoke in whispers now roar with truth. The city that outshone London has risen from the shadows, radiant again, in bronze and blood, and memory. Benin has come full circle, and in that circle, Africa stands unbroken. The brilliance of Benin was not an accident of time or chance. It was engineered, planned, governed, and sustained by systems so advanced that centuries later, scholars still struggle to comprehend how a pre-industrial African kingdom could have built such perfection. But the people of Benin understood something the colonizers never could, that civilization is not measured by machines or marble, but by harmony, the balance between spirit, structure, and the sacred duty to one's people. At the heart of Benin's system was order, not the rigid, fearful kind imposed by empires, but a moral rhythm known to the Edo people as Ogbon, the wisdom of collective governance. The Oba, the divine king, stood not above his people, but at the center of them, a living axis connecting gods and men, past and future. Every decision he made had to align with Mot-like principles of truth, balance, and justice, for he ruled not by birthright alone, but by moral weight. The Oba was the custodian of harmony, and if he ever betrayed that harmony, the ancestors would judge him before the people did. The political structure of Benin was both sophisticated and humane. Beneath the Oba was a council of chiefs, titled nobles, elders, and military leaders, who acted as the kingdom's brain and backbone. The Uzama, a group of high-ranking hereditary chiefs, advised the king and had the power to crown his successor. The Iwebo, Iwege, and Ibiwe guilds each managed different arms of the palace, from diplomacy to ceremony to domestic affairs. These were not mere servants. They were administrators, artisans, record keepers, and engineers. Their organization rivaled that of medieval Europe's royal courts, and in many ways surpassed them. But what made Benin truly extraordinary was how it fused artistry and governance into a single living system. The city was itself a reflection of divine geometry. Every street, every wall, every courtyard followed sacred alignment, mirroring the cosmic order that the Edo believed held the world together. The main thoroughfares radiated outward from the royal palace like veins from a heart. Each neighborhood had its own chief, responsible for maintaining peace, collecting tribute, and organizing labor. There was no chaos here, only coordination. When British explorers arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they described the city as a marvel of organization, with broad, clean streets lit by oil lamps and houses arranged in perfect symmetry. It was a vision of urban planning that London would not achieve for centuries. The city walls themselves were an engineering wonder, over 10,000 miles of earthworks stretching across the kingdom, forming what archaeologists now call the largest earthwork in the world carried out prior to the mechanical era. These weren't mere fortifications, they were living boundaries, lines of protection and power, dug by the collective labor of generations. The moats, embankments, and gates of Benin were built not only for defense, but to symbolize unity. Each citizen contributed to the maintenance of the city's structure, binding them to it spiritually, as well as physically. It was a social contract made of soil. Even commerce was sacred in Benin. The kingdom operated a complex market system dominated by women, traders, negotiators, and accountants whose authority rivaled that of the male chiefs. The Iolode, the women's leader, held enormous influence in economic and political decisions. The markets were not places of chaos, but of order and ceremony. Goods were displayed in symmetrical rows. Trade began with prayers to the ancestors, and ended with songs of gratitude. Foreign merchants, Portuguese, Dutch, and later English, marveled at the efficiency and wealth of Benin's trade networks. Ivory, pepper, textiles, and bronze flowed outward, while ideas and technologies flowed inward. Education, too, was woven into the fabric of society. The royal guilds were more than workshops. They were universities. Apprentices trained for years under master craftsmen, learning not just how to carve or cast, but how to invoke spiritual energy into their work. Every craft had its ritual, every material its prayer. The guilds were keepers of history as much as they were creators of art. Their knowledge was passed orally and through symbolic patterns in the works they made. A bronze plaque was never just decoration. It was a textbook, a legal record, a spiritual talisman, and above all, Benin understood accountability. The Oba may have been divine, but he was not untouchable. Councils could confront him, priests could advise him, and omens could warn him. The Edo believed that power, if misused, would rot a kingdom from within. Their rituals ensured that leadership remained humble, that even kings had to bow before the ancestors. This was not tyranny, it was sacred democracy, a theocratic meritocracy, where governance was bound by ethics, not ego. The colonizers, blind to everything sacred, saw none of this. To them, Benin's order was a mystery, its discipline mistaken for superstition, its wisdom dismissed as ritual. They could not comprehend that a city so spiritually guided could also be so technologically advanced. They wrote of the bronzes, but not the minds that made them. They mapped the ruins, but not the laws that sustained them. And so the lie spread that Africa had no systems, no science, no structure. But today, the records speak louder than ever. Archaeologists and historians now recognize Benin as one of the most advanced urban centers of its time. Its governance inspired surrounding kingdoms, its trade influenced continental economies, and its spiritual codes shaped the moral backbone of a region. In Benin, civilization was not about conquest or wealth. It was about alignment between the ruler and the ruled, the human and the divine, the individual and the collective. It was a democracy of spirit. Long before the West even had the word, Benin City was proof that Africa didn't just build kingdoms, it built order. It engineered civilization from the soul outward, and that truth, once buried under the ashes of empire, now stands unshakable in the light. The fall of Benin did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow tightening of a noose, a centuries-long collision between two worlds, one rooted in reverence, the other in greed. For generations, Benin had traded with Europe, at first on equal terms. Portuguese sailors in the late 1400s wrote admiringly of the city's grandeur, describing it as more organized and prosperous than Lisbon itself. They brought gifts, traded goods, and bowed before the Oba with respect. But over time, admiration curdled into envy. When European empires grew hungry for Africa's wealth, ivory, palm oil, and eventually, human lives, the relationship changed. What had begun as trade became extraction. What had once been partnership became pillage. And Benin, proud and independent, refused to bow. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire had conquered much of the Niger Delta. Benin was one of the last holdouts, an African state still controlling its own trade, enforcing its own laws, and refusing to accept British monopolies. The Oba, Oven Ramwan no Bazi, was not anti-European. He simply demanded fair exchange. He imposed trade restrictions to protect his people from exploitation. But the British called it obstruction. To them, an African king standing on equal footing was an insult to empire. They began to weave the narrative, the same one used across the continent, that the native ruler was a tyrant, that his people needed civilization, that intervention was for their own good. It was the oldest colonial lie. Underneath it lay one motive: profit. In January of 1897, the spark was lit. A British delegation led by Acting Consul General James Phillips demanded entry into Benin City, despite clear warnings from the Oba that it was a sacred period. the Igi festival, when no foreigners were allowed. The Oba's message was respectful, but firm. The gods must not be disturbed. But arrogance is deaf. Phillips and his men marched anyway, carrying hidden weapons and intentions. They never reached the city. Near Ugaton, Benin warriors ambushed the column, a desperate act of defense against a violation of sacred law. Most of the British party was killed. London exploded with outrage. The newspapers screamed massacre and called for vengeance. The empire had found its excuse. Within weeks, they assembled what they called a punitive expedition, a force of over 1,200 British soldiers, armed with Maxim guns, artillery, and fire. The mission was clear: to make an example of Benin, to erase it so thoroughly that no African power would ever defy the British again. In February 1897, the invasion began. Columns of troops advanced through the forests, burning villages along the way. The Edo warriors fought with unmatched courage, spears and muskets against machine guns, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and betrayed by the cruelty of modern war. By the time the British reached Benin City, it was over. The empire had brought the apocalypse. What they found stunned them: a city of stone walls, intricate palaces, and a level of artistry no one in Britain had imagined existed in Africa. Instead of recording it with respect, they set it ablaze. For 10 days, the city burned. Palaces were torched. Shrines were desecrated. Priests were executed. The royal women, Ioba, the mothers of kings, were humiliated and stripped of their sacred coral regalia. The Oba's statues were dragged down and melted for loot. When the flames finally died, Benin was no longer a city. It was a scar. The British soldiers looted everything they could carry. Thousands of bronze plaques, ivory masks, carved tusks, coral jewelry, and ancestral relics were packed into crates and shipped to London. Each piece was catalogued, not as sacred heritage, but as spoils of war. They paraded the bronzes in exhibitions, marveling at their beauty while ignoring the blood that stained them. They sold them to museums in Berlin, Paris, and New York. The very objects that had adorned the Oba's palace now hung in foreign galleries as curiosities of a lost African art. The lie was complete. They had burned civilization, then declared Africa primitive. Oba Oven Ramwan was captured after months in hiding. He was exiled to Calabar, stripped of his throne and dignity, forced to live out his days as a prisoner of empire. Yet even in defeat, he refused to kneel. When the British demanded he kneel before them in surrender, he stood tall and said, "A king does not kneel before strangers." That defiance, quiet, dignified, eternal, became the soul of Benin's resistance. As the years passed, the empire celebrated its victory. Textbooks in British schools described the expedition as a civilizing mission. The museums displayed the bronzes as proof of Europe's power to discover African beauty. And in Benin, silence reigned. The survivors rebuilt among the ashes, carrying their grief in whispers. But grief can become seed, because what the British didn't understand, what no colonizer ever understands, is that burning a city does not destroy its spirit. You can destroy walls, but not memory. You can scatter art, but not identity. You can exile a king, but you cannot exile truth. The invasion of 1897 became more than a tragedy. It became prophecy, a reminder that every empire that destroys truth eventually faces it again in the echoes of those they silenced. And as time moved forward, those echoes grew louder. The bronzes they stole became the evidence of their own hypocrisy. The art they looted became the testimony of Africa's greatness. For though the city had fallen, the world was beginning to awaken. The age of conquest was nearing its end, and from the ruins of Benin, a new chapter was waiting to rise, one that would turn the empire's pride into its greatest shame. Benin had fallen, yes, but its fall marked the beginning of Africa's rebirth.
The ashes spoke. Long after the flames died, long after the smoke had drifted across the Atlantic, long after the last British gunboat disappeared down the Niger, Benin's voice refused to fade. In the silence of the ruins, the bronzes began to whisper again.
not from the palace where they once gleamed, but from the cold halls of European museums. The empire had taken them as trophies, but the art had its own plan. Each face cast in bronze, each plaque of a warrior, each ivory carving of a queen, all of them became witnesses, eternal and unyielding. They stared from behind glass, saying, "We were never what you said we were." At first, the colonizers didn't understand the weapon they had placed on display. To them, the Benin bronzes were proof of their conquest, a demonstration of what Britain could seize, catalog, and claim. They hung the pieces in the British Museum, as if the act of possession itself had turned theft into scholarship. They called it anthropology. They called it art history. They called it civilization. But the truth was molten beneath the surface. Every piece of bronze was an indictment. Every plaque was evidence. It didn't take long for cracks to appear in the story. Scholars who saw the bronzes began to question how such complexity could emerge from a people the empire had labeled barbaric. The level of metallurgical skill defied 19th century European understanding. Lost wax casting, alloy control, and fine detailing that matched or surpassed Renaissance craftsmanship. The plaques showed processions, warriors, musicians, merchants, and kings, scenes of power and prosperity. These were not primitive trinkets. They were historical documents, encoded in metal, documenting centuries of African order and empire. The British could not explain it. They told themselves lies to stay comfortable. Maybe the Portuguese taught them. Maybe it was copied from foreign styles. But the bronzes carried motifs that predated European contact by hundreds of years. They showed ritual and lineage, rooted in an African cosmology older than the empire itself. Slowly, the Western scholars who studied them had to face the uncomfortable truth. Benin had been civilized long before London learned to pave its streets. Then something happened that the empire did not expect. The same objects it had stolen to prove African inferiority became the very evidence that destroyed that myth. In lecture halls and art salons, the conversation shifted. Anthropologists began to realize that Africa's history was not a blank space waiting to be filled by Europe. It was a continent of kings and city builders, philosophers and astronomers, engineers and artists. The Benin bronzes became the spearhead of that revelation. By the mid-20th century, as African nations rose toward independence, the art of Benin became a rallying cry. Black intellectuals and revolutionaries pointed to those bronzes as proof that Africa had built civilizations worthy of pride long before colonization. The bronzes became more than art. They were resurrection. In Lagos, in Accra, in Dakar, people whispered their names like prayers. Benin had fallen in fire, but its art had become scripture. Across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and the Americas, the story resonated with the descendants of the enslaved. Those who had been told they came from darkness now learned they came from cities that shone brighter than London. They began to paint, to sculpt, to sing, and in their art, the memory of Benin returned. Jazz, calypso, reggae, gospel, all carried echoes of the rhythm of bronze. The diaspora began to reclaim Africa, not as an abstract motherland, but as a living civilization that had once ruled with balance and brilliance. Even in Europe, the truth began to haunt the institutions that had hidden it. Curators in London, Berlin, and Paris found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. How did these treasures get here? Why do they remain? And what does it mean to celebrate art stolen from the ashes of empire? The world was changing. The moral foundation of empire was crumbling. By the 1960s and 70s, African historians and artists took the lead. Nigerian scholars, like Jacob Egarevba and Osemwowa Oviawe, began to document the oral histories of Benin, the stories of its obas, its guilds, its laws. Their research proved what had long been known in the heart of the Edo people. Benin's art was not an anomaly. It was the visual language of a sophisticated society. These weren't isolated masterpieces. They were a collective archive of a civilization that governed itself with elegance and depth. And as the truth spread,
the empire's narrative began to rot. The Western museums that had once been symbols of power became prisons for the very evidence that betrayed them. Every time a child from Nigeria, Ghana, or the Caribbean stood before a Benin plaque in the British Museum, the lie cracked a little more. They looked up at those faces, proud, stoic, regal, and saw themselves. They saw what had been hidden. The bronzes began to act like mirrors, forcing the world to confront the reflection it had tried to avoid. Visitors who once came to marvel at exotic African craftsmanship began to leave uneasy, sensing that something was wrong, that these works did not belong in these halls of empire. The more people looked, the clearer it became. This was not preservation, it was imprisonment. And from that realization, a movement was born. Artists, scholars, and activists across the world began demanding restitution, not just of objects, but of memory. They said, "Return what you stole, return the narrative, return the truth." Because the truth was this: Benin did not need validation from Europe. Its civilization had validated itself long before empire existed. The bronzes did not need museums to be immortal. They had already survived fire, exile, and time. They had carried the story of Benin through the darkness and now stood ready to bring it into light again. The empire thought it had silenced Benin by burning it to the ground. Instead, it had made the kingdom immortal. The art it stole became the voice of Africa reborn. And as the world began to listen, the question shifted from did Benin deserve its place in history to what does it say about history that it ever lost it? The world moves in circles. What is taken will one day return, and what is buried will rise again. For more than a century, the Benin bronzes waited, scattered across continents, locked in vaults, mislabeled in glass cases, staring silently at those who had forgotten their names. But time has a rhythm, and truth always keeps the beat. The ancestors were patient, and when the world was finally ready to listen, they began to come home. It started as whispers in the halls of academia, uncomfortable questions about provenance, about the ethics of empire. Then came the documentaries, the protests, the petitions. African scholars demanded answers. Students stood before British and German museum boards, their voices trembling, but their resolve unshakable. Return them. Return what you stole. The movement gathered momentum in the digital age. Images of the bronzes flooded social media, their gleaming faces now symbols of a stolen legacy. The world could see, with painful clarity, the beauty that had been hidden behind the word primitive. The outrage spread like fire. The more people learned, the harder it became to justify keeping what was not theirs. In 2018, a turning point arrived. French President Emmanuel Macron stood in Ouagadougou and declared, "African heritage cannot remain a prisoner of European museums." His words sent shockwaves through the cultural establishment. It was the first admission, from a head of state, that Europe's museums were built on theft. Soon after, the French government commissioned a report led by Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, two scholars who exposed, in meticulous detail, the scope of African looting. Their conclusion was simple: return everything that was taken without consent. The report became a spark that ignited the conscience of the world. In Germany, curators at the Humboldt Forum began to question their own collections. The truth was undeniable. Over 1,000 Benin bronzes lay in German museums, relics of colonial violence. In 2021, Germany made history by announcing the repatriation of hundreds of pieces to Nigeria. For the first time since 1897, crates marked Benin began their journey home, not as plunder, but as reconciliation. The return ceremonies were unlike anything the world had seen. When the bronzes arrived in Benin City, the streets filled with music, with dance, with prayer. Elders wept. Children reached out their hands to touch the faces of their ancestors. The Oba of Benin, wrapped in coral beads that glowed like fire in the sun, stood before the crowd and said, "Our fathers have returned." It was not just a political act. It was a spiritual homecoming. Each bronze carried more than history. It carried energy. The Edo people believed that every artwork forged in the royal guilds was born from invocation, that each cast head, each relief plaque, contains the essence of the ancestors it depicts. When those pieces left, a part of Benin's soul left with them, and when they returned, the city itself breathed again. The ceremonies were heavy with symbolism. Libations were poured to the earth. The drums of Ige thundered in rhythm with the heartbeat of the crowd. Women adorned in coral and white sang songs that had not been heard since before the invasion. The bronzes were placed in sacred chambers within the Oba's palace, not as museum exhibits, but as family reunited. The ancestors, they said, were finally at peace. Across the world, this return ignited something deeper, a reckoning not just with the theft of objects, but with the theft of truth. Museums that had built reputations on world heritage began facing lawsuits, protests, and moral collapse. The British Museum, holding over 900 Benin pieces, became the center of a storm. Each headline, each petition, each angry voice echoed the same message: the empire's treasures are Africa's tears. But the movement was not just about restitution. It was about reclamation, of memory, of pride, of authorship. African nations began investing in their own institutions, building spaces that would house the returning artifacts with reverence and modern innovation. In Nigeria, plans were made for the Edo Museum of West African Art, a grand project in Benin City, designed not as a colonial replica, but as a living archive of African excellence. Its walls would hold not only the bronzes, but the stories of the people who created them, told by African voices, in African rhythms. The diaspora joined the movement, bridging continents with solidarity. From Jamaica to Chicago, from London to Lagos, people of African descent celebrated the homecoming as their own. Artists created installations, musicians composed tributes, poets spoke the names of the Obas in verse. The bronzes had become more than symbols. They were proof that Africa's light could never be extinguished, and the returns continued. Universities, private collectors, and even churches began to quietly send pieces back. Some did so publicly, others in silence. Each one was a confession, a small piece of justice. The long road of repair had begun. Yet the story was not only about the artifacts returning, it was about what they awakened. In Benin, young artists took inspiration from the bronzes, learning the old lost wax methods, fusing tradition with innovation. Sculptors cast new works, not to replace what was lost, but to continue the lineage. The city was alive again, with creation, echoing the hum of furnaces and the ring of hammers on metal. The same art that once adorned the palaces now inspired a new generation to dream bigger. For the first time in a century, the spiritual map of Benin was complete again. The stolen voices had come home, and with them, the story had been restored. The empire once called it conquest. The world now calls it theft. But in Benin, they call it return, the fulfillment of prophecy. Because the elders always said, the ancestors never sleep. They wait until justice wakes the living, and now, justice has begun to stir. The ashes that once spoke in whispers now roar with truth. The city that outshone London has risen from the shadows, radiant again, in bronze and blood, and memory. Benin has come full circle, and in that circle, Africa stands unbroken.
Benin's story is not just a tale of what was lost. It's a lesson in what endures. When we speak of legacy, we are not only talking about artifacts or ruins. We are speaking about an idea, a rhythm, a way of being that has outlasted empires and rewritten the map of human civilization. The legacy of Benin is the proof that power can be refined, that beauty can be structured, and that African order was never chaos. It was harmony misunderstood by those who couldn't hear its song. At its core, the Benin Kingdom was built upon principles that modern society still struggles to grasp: the sanctity of balance, the power of art as governance, and the belief that leadership is sacred duty, not personal gain. The Oba did not rule through brute force alone. His power was divine, yet accountable. Every act, from the forging of bronze to the planting of yam, was a ritual of alignment between people, nature, and spirit. The system of governance was intricate, layered with councils of chiefs and guilds of craftsmen, where authority flowed like a river, steady, disciplined,
and collective. Even today, scholars marvel at how Benin managed a city of such complexity centuries before modern infrastructure. The city's design wasn't random, it was a reflection of cosmic geometry, each road radiating from the Oba's palace, like arteries from a heart. Every home, every market, every altar mirrored a vision of order that came from spiritual mathematics, a harmony between man and cosmos. While European cities were still stumbling through disease and disorder, Benin had already mastered the science of communal life, but perhaps the kingdom's greatest legacy lies in its art. The Benin bronzes were not mere decorations, they were philosophy in metal. Each casting captured an ideal: discipline, courage, lineage, faith. The faces were not portraits for vanity, but embodiments of principles. To carve a king's face was to forge his spirit in eternal form, to make leadership visible and memory immortal. That philosophy, that blending of art and governance, is something the modern world has forgotten. We separate creativity from leadership, beauty from power. Benin never did. To them, ruling without art was like breathing without air. That fusion of aesthetics and ethics is what gave Benin its immortality. Long after their city was burned, the art still spoke. It spoke in museums, in textbooks, in the quiet awe of those who looked upon it and knew. This could not have come from a primitive people. This came from genius. And that genius still lives on. You can see it in the design philosophies of modern African architecture, from Lagos, skyscrapers echoing the symmetry of ancient courtyards, to sculptures rising in Dakar and Accra that draw their lineage directly from the guilds of Benin. You can hear it in the drums of Afrobeat, the layered complexity of rhythm that mirrors the kingdom's political councils, each instrument an equal voice in a shared democracy of sound. You can even feel it in the movements of Pan-Africanism, the intellectual and cultural rebirth that says to the world, Africa defines itself. Benin's spirit reminds us that civilization is not a European invention, it's a human one, and Africa has always been its heart. The legacy of Benin stands as evidence that greatness was never imported here, it was born here. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. If the colonial powers had come to learn instead of conquer, the world might have evolved under a different philosophy, one rooted not in domination, but in balance. The echoes of Benin ripple through Africa's new generation. Young artists reclaim the lost wax method, pouring molten bronze as their ancestors did. Filmmakers craft stories that bring the Obas and queens back to life on screen. Historians reassemble fragments once dismissed as myth, rebuilding the narrative piece by piece. Even politicians now speak of African models of governance, drawing inspiration from pre-colonial systems that prioritized harmony over hierarchy. In every corner of the continent, a quiet renaissance stirs, one that looks backward not with nostalgia, but with purpose. Because Benin teaches that memory is not a weight, it's a weapon. The memory of what we once were becomes the blueprint for what we can become again. And for the African diaspora, scattered by the winds of slavery, cut off from ancestral soil, Benin's legacy offers a homecoming of the mind. It tells every child of African descent, you come from builders, you come from thinkers, you come from people who lit their cities while others walked in darkness. It is a call to pride, not arrogance, pride as reclamation, as healing. The world still measures civilization by the wrong metrics, by technology, wealth, conquest, but Benin's measure was spiritual coherence. Its cities thrived not because of steel or empire, but because of unity, a belief that art, governance, and spirit are one. In that sense, Benin is not a ghost of the past, it is a prophecy of the future. Imagine a world that remembered this, a world where architecture speaks, art governs, and leaders are accountable, not to greed but to ancestors. Imagine a world that looks at Benin, not as a ruin, but as a roadmap, because maybe, just maybe, the answers we seek in modern governance were already perfected in the red earth of an African city long ago. Benin was never lost, it was waiting for the world to mature enough to understand what it had built. The city that outshone London wasn't destroyed, it was buried beneath centuries of lies, waiting for truth to uncover it. And now that it has begun to rise again, we must ask ourselves, what will we do with this rediscovered wisdom? Because if we truly honor Benin, we do not just remember it, we rebuild its spirit in our art, our systems, our pride. The world once burned it out of envy. Now it's our duty to reignite it out of love. When the British burned Benin City in 1897, they didn't just destroy walls and palaces, they erased a story. They silenced a civilization. The flames that consumed the kingdom were only the beginning of a far more deliberate fire, the fire of distortion. What couldn't be looted in bronze was rewritten in ink. What couldn't be taken by gunpowder was conquered by narrative. The suppression of Benin was not accidental, it was systematic. It was psychological warfare masquerading as scholarship. The British expedition's official reports described the city they burned as barbaric, even as they filled crates with thousands of refined bronzes that proved otherwise. They photographed their loot, displayed it in London's museums, and wrote in their journals that these treasures must have been created by some lost European influence. Because how could Africans have achieved this? The lie was not ignorance, it was strategy. By the early 20th century, the myth of African primitivism had become the backbone of empire. Every map, every textbook, every museum label reinforced the same message. Europe created, Africa received. Europe invented, Africa imitated. The same people who marveled privately at Benin's sophistication publicly dismissed it as an anomaly, a freak accident of civilization in a continent they needed to portray as empty and backward. Colonialism could not justify itself if Africa was already advanced, so the record had to be altered. They changed the language. The Kingdom of Benin became a tribal chiefdom, the Oba became a warlord, the palace became a compound. They stripped the words of dignity, and with those words, they stripped identity. They painted the invasion as a moral mission, a campaign to stop barbaric practices like human sacrifice, while ignoring the piles of corpses left by their own soldiers. They claimed to bring civilization to a people who had been living in one for centuries. European newspapers spread the narrative like wildfire. Readers in London and Berlin saw sketches of savage warriors and fetish worshippers. They were told that the looting of Benin was an act of salvation, that Britain had rescued priceless art from destruction, as if the city's creators would have burned their own masterpieces. In reality, the only destruction came from the empire itself. But propaganda has a strange power. It turns thieves into heroes, victims into villains, and truth into myth. For decades, the academic world played accomplice. Anthropologists and historians, most funded by colonial institutions, reinforced the same lies. They studied Benin's art as ethnographic artifacts, not as fine art. They treated the bronzes as curiosities of a vanishing race, catalogued but never respected. The great universities of Europe built their prestige upon research that erased the people who gave them their material. And when African voices rose to challenge them, those voices were silenced or dismissed as emotional, unscientific. Western academia claimed objectivity, but objectivity was a mask for control. It wasn't about truth. It was about who had the power to define it. Museums became the cathedrals of this colonial theology. Inside, under soft light, African art was displayed behind glass, separated from spirit. Plaques describing Benin's bronzes used words like unknown origin, possibly influenced by Portuguese technique, or made by an extinct culture. The irony was cruel. The descendants of that extinct culture were standing outside those same museums, alive, breathing, and still creating. But to the empire, their presence didn't fit the script. Even in the 20th century, when independence movements swept across Africa, the myth of the primitive continent persisted. Hollywood turned it into entertainment. Textbooks continued to omit names like Oba Iwar and Oba Ovan Ramwin. African children learned about the age of exploration before they ever heard of the Great Benin Walls, a city whose earthworks were 4 times longer than China's Great Wall and took centuries to build. Silence became the final weapon. Generations grew up believing that Africa had no written history, no architecture, no art of global value. Yet every bronze in the British Museum, every ivory tusk engraved with cosmic precision, screamed the opposite. The suppression wasn't just historical, it was spiritual. When a people are taught that their ancestors were nothing, they begin to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressors. That is the cruelest victory of empire, not the taking of land, but the theft of memory. Benin's story was buried beneath shame, rewritten as cautionary tale instead of celebration. But even in silence, truth has a heartbeat. It pulsed in oral traditions passed down in Edo families, in the songs of the griots who refused to forget, in the prayers whispered at the shrines of Ogun and Olokun. The empire could burn bronze, but it could not burn memory. The ancestors do not die, they wait. And so they waited, through colonialism, through the wars of independence, through decades of neglect, until the world began to listen again. When modern historians finally returned to the record, they found the cracks. The old reports didn't add up. The contradictions were too glaring. How could a tribe produce urban planning that rivaled Renaissance Europe? How could barbarians master metallurgy that modern scientists still study with awe? The truth had been hiding in plain sight, and so the story began to shift again. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably, African scholars began to reclaim the narrative. Western institutions were forced to admit their complicity. The old myths began to crumble, but the damage remains. A century of lies cannot be undone overnight. The suppression of Benin's legacy shaped not only how the world sees Africa, but how Africa sees itself. The mission now is not just restitution, it's restoration. To rebuild memory where it was burned, to replant pride where it was uprooted. Because until Africa tells its own story, the world will keep repeating the colonial version. And the story of Benin, the city that outshone London, is the key to breaking that cycle. Its truth is the antidote to centuries of distortion. Its art is the evidence. Its survival is the verdict. The empire wrote the first draft of history in ink, but Benin wrote its truth in bronze, and bronze does not burn.
They tried to bury the truth, but the earth remembers. The smoke that rose over Benin in 1897 was supposed to be the end, the erasure of a kingdom that had dared to shine too brightly. But fire cannot consume memory. Beneath the ashes, the embers of greatness still glowed. And now, more than a century later, those embers are blazing again. Benin is no longer just a chapter in a forgotten history book. It is a mirror, one that reflects what Africa was, what it still is, and what it will become again. The city that outshone London was not an anomaly. It was a symbol of what African civilization had already achieved before the world came with chains and flags. Benin stood as proof that Africa was not a passive landscape waiting for discovery. It was the heart of human innovation, pulsing with law, design, spirituality, and art that defined entire ages of humanity. For centuries, they called Africa dark, but if there was ever a darkness, it was the shadow of the lies they told to hide our light. The British didn't destroy Benin because it was savage. They destroyed it because it was civilized, because it was organized, because it was brilliant enough to dismantle every illusion of European superiority. The city's light exposed the empire's insecurity, and so the empire did what cowards always do. It destroyed what it could not understand. But they could not destroy the rhythm. The rhythm survived in the hearts of the people who fled into the forests and carried the stories with them. It survived in the cadence of Yoruba drums, in the red earth of Edo land, in the quiet defiance of African artisans who refused to stop creating. It crossed the Atlantic with the enslaved encoded in songs of sorrow and faith, reborn as gospel, jazz, reggae, and blues. Every beat of that music is Benin's heartbeat, pulsing through time, unbroken. Today, the truth has found its voice again. Scholars, artists, and storytellers are piecing together the mosaic of what was stolen. In Benin City, a new dawn rises. Streets once marked by ruin now hum with revival. Artisans cast new bronzes, using the same lost wax method that their ancestors mastered centuries ago. The forges burn again, not with the fire of destruction, but with the flame of creation. The children of Benin are rebuilding what empire tried to erase. Not replicas, but rebirths, and across the continent, the ripples spread. African youth, long starved of historical pride, are learning that greatness was never imported, it was inherited, that the architectures of civilization, from law to art to governance, were built here first, that before Europe dreamed of democracy, Africa practiced it in councils and guilds. Before Europe lit its cities, Benin's lamps already glowed in the night. Before the empire carved its monuments, Africa had already built kingdoms that touched the heavens. This is the Great Awakening, the decolonization of the mind, because the real war was never just over land or gold or artifacts. It was over memory, over who gets to define civilization. The return of the Benin bronzes is more than restitution. It is the return of Africa's reflection. Every bronze that comes home is a piece of the soul restored, a reminder that the empire's lie was never stronger than the continent's truth. And as that truth resurfaces, the balance begins to shift. The world that once looked down on Africa is now forced to look up in awe. The same museums that displayed stolen art now issue apologies. The same nations that once denied Africa's genius now study it. The same voices that mocked are now silent, drowned out by the chorus of a continent reclaiming its name. But this isn't about revenge, it's about restoration. Benin's legacy teaches that power without spirit corrupts, and spirit without memory fades. To heal, Africa must remember. And to remember, Africa must tell its stories, not as tragedies, but as epics of resilience and brilliance. Because the descendants of Benin are not victims of history, they are its continuation. They are the living proof that empires fall, but cultures endure. They are the keepers of fire once thought extinguished. And with each retelling, each sculpture, each truth spoken aloud, that fire grows brighter. So tonight, let the world know, the city they burned has risen again, not in the ashes of nostalgia, but in the flames of rebirth. Its streets live on, in Lagos and Accra, in Kingston and Chicago, in every heartbeat that carries the rhythm of pride and remembrance. The spirit of Benin is alive wherever a child of Africa lifts their head and says, I come from kings, I come from builders, I come from brilliance. They thought they could erase Africa's light, but history has a way of correcting itself. The bronzes speak, the earth remembers, the people awaken, and the city that once outshone London will outshine it again. Not in gold or empire, but in truth, because they tried to bury the truth. But we are the descendants of those who remember.